Changing just exclusionary practices and the exclusion of students using suspension and expulsion is not the only thing that we've got to focus on. One of the things that we do have to focus on is, yes, accountability, how we treat kids during the school day when they do misbehave. We also need to look at the broader network and the system that's contributing to our students' behavior and how adults are reacting to our kids. We're fortunate to have Dr. Tina Martinez with us for the second time, and she's going to sort of look at the work taking place here in Nashville, how it benchmarks against some of the national work. We're looking at our actual data. One of the things that we said with Passage from the very beginning is we would tell the truth at all times, and that we weren't going to focus on what may be happening at some school district elsewhere. We want to focus on what's happening here in Nashville. You'll notice that throughout this process, we've had a lot of different parties involved in this work. We have school people, law enforcement, juvenile court, researchers, Vanderbilt community, faith-based, so we have a lot of people in this work. And we've done a lot of good things in our 3 years. But now we want to make this shift. We want to go to the next level of really looking at reducing exclusion, but at the same time, nurturing and helping our kids. But before I do move on, I do want to recognize our elected school board officials. So Ms. Joanne Brandon, Ms. Sharon Gentry are here with us this afternoon, so I'm glad to have them here. And at this point, now Dr. Felder was supposed to be here. She may be running a little bit late, so I'll pick up on the MNPS perspective just a little bit. When we started this work 3 years ago, we were very clear about African American males particularly are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white counterparts. Latino males twice as likely, African American females twice as likely. That is our reality. We spent a lot of time focusing on what are the internal systems and structures necessary to help our kids be successful. Now we've really focused on, but what are the systems that need to be built in schools to help address the issues as they arise? Passage was never about making schools unsafe. That's not our goal. Our goal is to provide appropriate responses to student behavior, and also to have very, very strong and clear support systems, because most of our kids are behaving or misbehaving as a result of some other factor that's impacting their life. And we've done a great job of really addressing that. Dr. Martinez, I'm hoping will touch on that a little bit herself. But at this point, her and Alethea are going to sort of talk about the work that's going on and its connection to the Annenberg Institute, the Schott Foundation, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Martinez. So, Alethea, come on up.
First of all, it's my pleasure to be here with you and to be co-hosting this with MNPS and the Oasis Center and the entire Passage Steering Committee. And as Tony said, they have been working on this work with Passage, which stands for Positive and Safe Schools Advancing Greater Equity, for over 2 years now, and have stayed with it and are committed to this for the long haul. One of the things I'm just going to say really quickly is that, you know, the really very important part about the work that's been happening in Nashville is that it is a partnership and an alliance with the community and with the district. And we believe at the Annenberg Institute that's how we get to the point where we can really begin to change work. When we have the community and the district at a shared table to both investigate and examine the challenges and work through to solutions. So it's my pleasure, distinct pleasure, to welcome back to Nashville Tia Martinez. So for those of you who don't know Tia, who she is, Tia Martinez is a consultant and principal partner in Forward Change Consulting. Previously, she was the Chief Equity Officer at the Stupski Foundation and was also the Acting Director of Education at the Warren Institute on Race, Ethnicity, and Diversity at the University of California, Berkeley Law School. And she led a policy unit that produced research, policy prescriptions, and curriculum innovation on issues related to education reform and racial justice. She has been a strategic consultant to the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education and led strategic planning and rollout of new strategies in 12 regional offices. She spent decades doing social change work in communities around the country. Tia has an AD in history from Harvard University, a master's in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from Stanford Law School. So it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome back to Nashville, Tia Martinez.
Thank you. Before I get into all the numbers and the data and all of that stuff, I want to share a little bit about why I do this work. Like most things in our lives that we do and that we care deeply about, this has to do with my family, okay? So I came of age in the late 80s and the first part of the 90s, and my family was very touched by what was going on during those years. Okay. My father was an iron worker, and my mother was a preschool teacher, and I had a really hard time. I had a brother and a sister, a very much younger sister, and a brother who was closer to me, and I had a really hard time with my mom from the time I was little, in part because I've always had this particular gender identity, this kind of like tomboy thing. That's just from as long as I could remember. You know, I didn't want, they want to put me in dresses, they want to give me earrings. Now my mother was a beautiful woman. She was and she loved being a beautiful woman, and I was their first child. So it's like you have expectations, this is gonna be my daughter, you know, and so I was not the kid she imagined having. I was not the daughter she imagined having. Now, as it sometimes happens in families, I got super close to my dad, right? And he just was someone who always accepted me without question. He just had that love. Do you know that love which is like, you're mine. We'll work everything else out, right? And I just adored him. I wanted to be like him, right? And then when I was 11, my little sister was born. And a couple years after that, my father started using crack. And he used crack for about 20 years. He stayed closely in our family, right? He did not leave. He stayed there, which was a gift and a burden because it meant all of the chaos was right in front of us, right? My mother struggled mightily with mental health stuff her whole life. And this was just such a big challenge for her, considering she didn't have the tools to deal with it. So my life just was turned upside down, and my brother and sister's life. Now I had this little sister who was 2 years old, right? Little baby, right? And I felt, I was one of those kids at school, but who was having a lot going on. But the thing is, I turned inward like a lot of girls do, right? I didn't go outward. I was depressed, I was quiet, I felt so alone. The one thing that made me feel like a good person, that made me feel like I had meaning, was protecting my brother and sister and trying to protect my mom and dad, trying to help them as much as I could. And I got an identity. I felt like I was their parent, right? And I wanted to shelter them. I wanted to bring them through this storm, right? And so, especially with my little sister, since I was so much older, right? Bringing her through this storm. When she graduated from high school, I was so proud, right? And when she went to college, I was so proud. And she finished college and she moved in with her boyfriend. She lived just right close to me in San Francisco. And I had a little tiny bit of pride, actually, a little bit of, maybe even a little conceit, right? Because I thought, part of me was like, oh, look, I could do this and mom and dad couldn't, right? I also kind of thought it was my achievement, right? I had got her through, right? I had saved her. The thing is, when she was 25, she took her own life, okay? And I collapsed. I was 36 at that time. But because I had thought I had saved her, then if I had saved her, then I must have failed her in some way, okay? That led me on a search to try to understand the bigger picture, to try to understand what did it mean for her to be 2 or 3 years old and not have any grown-ups who could take care of her, to have a 13-year-old and a 12-year-old, sister and brother as the only. What was happening? How did all of this happen? And sometimes I would think, oh, my family, everyone in my family, they're just so out there, right? I needed to understand the bigger story, right? I needed to understand the history behind it. And when I dug into the history and I figured out what we were part of, I realized that I was in beautiful company of so many other people who were struggling with the same things, and that it would be possible for us to link arms, and not in that heroic individual way that I thought I was doing with my sister, but together actually change the big policies, the big things that were happening in our community to heal folks in the community. So that's how I got to this work. So I want to start by talking about the changes. So I had the pleasure this earlier today of doing going through this with youth at Oasis. And I realized that all of their parents were my age, right? And that was a good point. I was like, okay, your parents were in the 70s and 80s. Okay, so I came into this world around 1970 myself, right? And so that's the year we're gonna talk about it. That is a year when things began to change in this country in a big way. And these changes matter. We can talk about the school to prison pipeline, but it doesn't begin at kindergarten. It doesn't even begin at the suspension. There are deeper roots to this that go way, way back, and we need to identify those deeper roots. In the last 45 years, a huge shift, this says structural shifts in the economy. All that means is the kind of jobs that were available to people with a high school degree or less changed, okay? Now, in 1970, who was the biggest employer in the United States? Guesses?
The United States.
The government, the military? Nope, close, but no. Car industry. Who said car industry? Car industry was General Motors. Okay? Today, who is the biggest employer in the United States? Walmart. Okay. So now I just want you to think on a job at GM and a job at Walmart. How are they different? Pay, huge, right? What else? Benefits. What else? Full-time, right? What about your schedule? You got control of your schedule? Hours, right? Right, jobs, absolute job security. Got a union?
Yes.
Union, right? Day and night, can you have that job and support your family, buy a house at GM?
Yes.
If you're working at Walmart? No. Okay, that's it. That's all that needs to be said about that, okay? So the jobs are disappearing, right? And it's not that we talk a lot about everyone needs a college degree, but the fact of the matter is we still have lots and lots of jobs here. You didn't need a college degree to work in the factory back then, right? You came in, they trained you, right? You didn't even need a high school degree, right? Now we have a lot of work out here where you don't need a college degree. It's just back then it used to pay well, and now it pays nothing, okay? So that's that background. At the same time, the jobs, and remember this is 1970s, so we're just at the beginning of women really moving into the workforce in big numbers. This is gonna have a pretty intense impact on men, okay? That first wave. The same time the jobs are going down, what's exploding in this country? Prisons. So what happens? We enter this tough on crime period, okay? We change a number of laws. Okay, one of them is we make more things that were misdemeanors felonies. A misdemeanor is something which you go a year and less, you go to jail. A felony is over a year and you go to prison, okay? What we did in this, it's like we're being too weak, especially around drugs. The first manifestation of this was the drug war, right? So we're being too easy on these folks, right? So what we need to do is we need to take a bunch of misdemeanors and turn them into felonies, right? Okay, so now the same holding, possession of drugs in 1975 and 1983, 75 it was a misdemeanor, 83 you go to prison behind it and you end up with a felony, right? Now it wasn't just that more things were felonies, the other thing is we also decided that we wanted people to go to prison for a very, very long time. Okay? And we were concerned because back then, judges had a lot of the power, a lot of the discretion to decide sentences. Okay? So you have your process where you're arrested. Usually what will happen is you'll plea, right? Then you'll go to a sentencing phase, which is separate from that. And in that sentencing phase, it used to be that the judge would listen. People would come up, they'd talk about it, and the judge had these rough guidelines, but they were very rough, right? And then the judge could decide based on all those factors what they thought the sentence would be. Also, in 1970, we still had a prison system that thought it was about rehabilitation, right? That said it was about treatment. Today's prison system is unapologetically about punishment. Okay? So in that treatment regime, there also was this sort of indeterminate sentencing, which basically meant we're going to see how you do, right? So you're going to go to prison, and if we see all these improvements, well then, you're better. You can go out. All of that washed away. Instead, you've got basically like equations, right? So it's a drug felony. This is your second drug felony. And it resulted in people, many, with nonviolent drug felonies getting incredibly, incredibly long sentences. Now, I'm from California, okay? So we really pioneered a lot of this stuff. Like, we pioneered 3 strikes you're out, right? You know, we pioneered a lot of this get tough legislation. And then when Bill Clinton was president, him and the Congress and the Senate passed the 1994 crime bill, okay? What that did, basically, is it said, oh, California, what you're doing, we think that's pretty cool. We're gonna scale it. And how did they scale it? They scaled it the way the federal government scales something. It says, federal government can't force a state to change its criminal laws, right? But what it can do is it can provide an incentive, right? So it said, if you change your laws, right, and you adopt these mandatory minimums and this get tough on crime stuff, we will give you money to build prisons and money for police, for more police, okay? But you got to do one thing in return. What's the one thing? What is the accountability measure they asked for? Fill them up and increase arrests, all right? So you could get that, but you had to fill them up, and fill them up they did. What this led to was just a massive explosion of incarceration. And at the same time that we had this so at the same time the jobs were going away, it becomes more and more likely that you get caught up in the criminal justice system. At that same time, policing was changing. Policing was the war on drugs, the war on terror. It was becoming more militarized, right? And one of the ideas that had come out of the war on drugs was this idea of broken windows. How many people know about broken windows policing? Okay, great. So you know, it's this idea that you need to sweat the little stuff, right? So you need to aggressively enforce the misdemeanors, not the violent stuff, not even the drug stuff. We're talking about like open containers, riding your bicycle on the sidewalk and not the street, standing in the street, all of that kind of stuff. You have to do that because if you let people get away with the little things, then it ends up being the big things. This led to stop and frisk, okay? This led to saying whole neighborhoods were basically places where anyone in that neighborhood was suspect. And what it meant is that black and brown, primarily boys, were submitted to a kind of aggressive policing over the little stuff, okay? So exactly when the work is disappearing, it becomes much more likely that you're gonna have an interaction with the police, break a law that will probably now be defined as a felony and go away for a very long time. Now, when you're doing that in communities, in particular in black and brown communities, and you do it to a really great extent, what happens is you make it really hard to form families, right? Okay, if you're a heterosexual woman, right, and you want to have a family and you want to get married, right? It's incredibly hard to do that when a huge chunk of the men are unemployed or cycling through the prison system. What that does, that makes for an incredibly fragile coupling, okay, that breaks apart, okay? So literally the New York Times wrote last year about 1.5 missing black men. Did people see that? In the census, there's 1.5 missing black men. They're missing because the census count doesn't count people in prison, right? So what that means is that literally skews the male to female ratio for black women. It literally makes it incredibly hard to form a family that's stable and stays together. And indeed, what we've seen is a huge growth of single-parent families, okay, across all races, right? Now, the next thing that happened was neighborhoods changed. In 1970, there weren't neighborhoods that were all black and brown and all like poor or low income. You didn't have that. Now, trust, you had all black neighborhoods. You had all brown neighborhoods. You had all black neighborhoods because you had legal segregation, right? Okay. But once that was lifted, once the Fair Housing Act, right, now if you had money, you could get out. So before, what did black neighborhoods look like? You'd have the unemployed person living next to the teacher, right? Living next to the construction worker, living next to the doctor. You had mixed class there, and that's resources for people. Think about those social resources you have. And when in the wake of Reverend King's assassination, the Federal Housing Authority, the Federal Housing Act law was passed, what it did is it allowed those middle class black folks who had enough money to get out. Now, mind you, very, very weak law, terrible enforcement mechanisms, which meant that yes, the African American middle class could get out, but guess what? It didn't stop all the discrimination continuing to happen in all of the white flight, such that what you got were black suburbs, right? So you have that movement out, right? But still, what happened to everyone left behind? The problem is, everyone left behind was poor. The anti-discrimination laws didn't help them because they didn't have the money. I mean, this is what King's Poor People's Movement was about, right? You cannot have all that discrimination, but if you don't have the money to move in. Now, when you take a lot of people who are poor and all the things that go along with poverty, right, and you mush it into a small area, right, you put it, and in everyone, you take a lot of suffering and you compress it, okay? What happens? What do you get? Shake it up, what do you get? Trauma, absolutely. You get more suffering. It's like synergistic effect, right? It just creates more of it. It's called, in the social science literature, concentration effects, okay? When you take a lot of suffering and you put a lot of folks with suffering together, you get more suffering. One of the key manifestations of this is violence, okay? Violence in families and violence in the street. Now, it just happens that these two things here, single parent families and neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage, right? Those two things are particularly hard on boys. They're particularly hard on boys of all races, okay? For whatever reason, girls have proven more resilient to these forms of disadvantage, right? In part because girls internalize, and when you internalize, you're less likely to be perceived as misbehaving and a bad kid, right? Because you keep to yourself, you're quiet, right? Boys externalize, right? So they're externalizing that. Now you know when they're sitting there in class and they're externalizing their pain, and kids communicate with us in this irritating way where they don't ask for help, they just behave, they act, and you have to be like, oh, I get it, that's what you need, right? So when the boys were behaving in a way which was asking for help, they were punished. Okay. Now, against that, two things happened. With all of that going on, you bring in the rise of exclusionary discipline. What's exclusionary discipline? Exclusionary discipline simply means someone misbehaves in class, you push them out of school, okay? So they go out of school, farther away from help. It also can mean that they go from a more well-resourced mainstream educational setting to a less resource mainstream educational setting. A great example is how kids who are struggling are pushed into alternative schools. Now the thing is, I don't know what it's like here, but in California, you don't need as much seat time in alternative schools. Literally, your day is 2 to 3 hours shorter, and it's supplemented with packets of independent study work. So you actually, when your level of need is high, you're getting less, okay? This is also true of when you end up in special education, right? And in separate classes. All of those are exclusion. Now the thing about it is we didn't really do that a lot before 1970. That's something really new. And it interacted with standard-based accountability. Standard-based accountability, No Child Left Behind testing, right? The thing about No Child Left Behind is it created an accountability regime that was powerful because it forced folks to disaggregate. It meant all of the data had to be disaggregated by race so we could finally see what was going on. Now, its weakness was it was super strong on test scores. It wanted test scores to get higher, right? And super weak for a bunch of really fascinating political reasons on high school graduation rates, okay? So essentially, up until 2006, spellings fixed this, and then one by one, states have come into compliance, and we've actually seen an increase in the graduation rate. But up to that time, if you're a school and you're failing, and you're in danger of having the district take you over, or you're at the district level and the state's gonna take you over. If you're facing those things, if you're a principal, what's the quickest way to get your test scores up? Where you don't have to do PD for lots of teachers, where you don't have to introduce new curriculum. What is the quickest way to try to get those to move in a year? Get rid of your low scores. Get rid of your, like when you have a number of games, you have an average and get to drop your lowest two. What happens to your average? It shoots right up. So you can change nothing, but you can get rid of kids. and bring up your scores. These things interacted to produce the school-to-prison pipeline, okay? And that is, it led to systematically pushing young people from the most disadvantaged families and neighborhoods out of the school system and into the criminal justice system. What we're going to talk about today takes it one step further. Because the thing is, when I was talking to those young people who are all probably between 15 and 19, right? So I'm their parent, right? Okay? Some of them are either now parents or will be soon. That's 3 generations who've experienced this, okay? So this was this reality, and what I'm gonna say, the kind of, the punchline of all of this is that when we suspend or push a kid out of school, we set off dominoes, and they fall in such a way that it makes it more likely that their child will get suspended from school. And so disadvantage goes from one generation to another, okay? Okay, so not sure if you guys can see this, but this is the rates of suspension for white students, okay? All right? So you see here between 72, 73, and 11 and 12, you go from 3% to 5%. You're going to see here we're getting a dip. In the last couple years, we've begun to get a dip down to 4. But essentially, between the 70s, early 70s, it almost doubles. This is Latinos. Latinos start 3%. This is the percent of kids who've been suspended out of school 1 or more times, okay? So this doesn't include in school, this doesn't include, and this is K-12. So this includes the babies. This includes the 10 and unders, right? So look at what happens with Latino, right? It starts just with white, but then you see it diverge until it's 7%, it over doubles there before coming back down to 5%. And see this space in between here? Oops, the space in between here, all of that is the school discipline gap, right? That's the gap, right? This is African Americans, okay? Between 72 and 2012, it almost triples from 6 to 16. This is the hopeful piece. Do you see what's happening? We're finally seeing these numbers go down. Now, when you look at these numbers, one important question to ask is, well, maybe kids were acting crazier. I mean, this is crazy. These are different times. Maybe you actually had a different kind of group of kids in class that had more issues, right? So I think that is absolutely true. Does anyone know when the height of youth violence was? Between 1970 and 13-14. When was youth violence at its absolute peak? Yeah, late 80s? Anyone else? It was 1994, okay? Crack epidemic, absolutely, 94. Highest levels ever. So that would be about right here, okay? Since then, youth violence has fallen and fallen and fallen and fallen and fallen, and we are now at the lowest levels of youth violent crime since they began collecting numbers. But look what happens over here. These numbers just continue to climb and climb and climb, right? So almost certainly, you would say some of that increase right there has to do with more violent crime, but then why, when youth crime starts to go down, do they continue to go up? One of the answers is, we took this data and we said, let's just look at the really serious things. But let's just look at like the fighting where someone gets hurt, bringing a gun to school, right? You know, drug sales. Let's look at the really serious stuff and see what happens. And what you see is the really serious stuff is relatively flat. You don't see this increase. What's driving this increase is a broader range of more minor misbehaviors, okay? And one way to understand it is a lot of the stuff that in our day, right, in school would have resulted in you coming over here, I'm gonna call your mother, right? This is what's gonna happen. All of that stuff got like bumped up to the next level. Well, the stuff that you would get a talking to, and maybe a call home and a talking to, now you get suspended for. Okay? And what you get suspended for, what happens now? What we got suspended for, what happens to kids when they do that? When you get in a fight, you get expelled and arrested. Okay? So all of the kind of punishment gets pushed up. Okay? Let's now just look at some of the rates before we go into the traveling the school to prison pipeline. This is national data from 13-14, okay? This is collected by the federal government, the Office of Civil Rights. So first, let's look at, this is African American, Latino, and white, okay? 7% of African American pre-K through 5th graders get suspended out of school 1 or more times every year. It's about 1 in 13. That's an absurdly high number for such little kids. That is an absurdly high number for such little kids. Because remember, this is just out of school suspension. So I want in the back of your head to be thinking of how many office referrals and in-school suspensions and everything else was this 9-year-old boy, this 7-year-old boy, this 6-year-old girl experiencing. But look at Latino and white, there's no racial gap. They're exactly the same at elementary school. What happens when we go to middle and high school? Suspension rates, unsurprisingly, go way up, right? You're entering adolescence, right? A developmental time where people are going to push boundaries, right? But look at that. 20% of African American middle to high school students, 1 in 5 are suspended 1 or more times out of school in the course of a year. Okay? And then look at this. Latino goes up to 8%, but white only up to 5%. So in those higher grades, you see the gap emerge. And a lot of times when your districts give you the information, they give it all in one big bucket, right? K-12. So you need to get underneath that to see both at the elementary level this, which there's just a moral imperative to address that, and this. This then is boys. These are boys in secondary school, boys in middle and high school. 1 in 4 African American boys over the course of the school year in the nation will be suspended 1 or more times. Okay. This number up here, this 32%, this nearly 1 in 3, that's African American boys with IEPs who are special education eligible. Okay. And when we saw this, we were a little surprised because, as you know, most of you know here, that if you get special education, if you're IDEA eligible, right, you actually get a bunch of extra money attached to you. Okay? And what else do you get? You also have to have a behavioral plan in place. That means there has to be the teacher and the principal and you need to work out, okay, this is what we're going to do if they do this. This is what, all right? And you also have a whole set of due process rights. Okay? You are not allowed to be suspended for something that is a manifestation of your disability. Okay? Unfortunately, well, first, what do you think, in this case, black boys, if you're familiar with the categorization in special education, what subcategory has the highest rates of suspension, right? ED, right? It's ED, and it also has the highest level of representation of black children in it. Now, reason says if emotional disturbance it can't be a manifestation, then why is this happening? It's happening because a manifestation hearing requirement doesn't kick in until your 10th day of suspension. So you have to be, like you could have got 10, on the 11th, you'll get that hearing, right? So what's happening is there's just tons of suspensions happening underneath that bar. The other thing I want to point out here is about black girls. Okay? So I've been doing this work for a while, and one of the things was to say we really need to look at what's happening to our boys in black and brown communities, right? In the process of doing that, I had a blind spot though, okay? When we talk about suspension, consistently, black girls have the second highest suspension rates after black boys, higher than Latino boys, higher than Native boys, higher than Southeast Asian boys. But in the construct I created, they were left out. Let's look at here. This is female secondary students with disabilities, 1 in 4, okay? This is black girls in middle or high with disabilities. Look, higher than Latino boys, higher than white boys. This is Nashville, okay? This again is 13-14, this is the federal data, okay? You see, 9%. The elementary numbers are higher, Latino numbers about the same, whites there. This is secondary students. 26% of African American secondary students, 18% of Latino secondary students, and 12%. Oops. This is male secondary students. You can see the numbers are a bit higher. They're just like a chunk up higher than the national rates. Not wildly higher though, right? This though is wildly higher. 40% of black boys with IEPs in middle and high school are getting suspended out of school 1 or more times. That number is higher. As is this, 1/3 of black girls with IEPs. in middle or high school are getting suspended. Again, higher than Latino boys, higher than white boys. The good news, because God knows we need some good news here, right, is that we're making progress here in Nashville, okay? So first of all, the federal data collection was in 11-12 and then again in 13-14, and indeed we saw a drop. So this is African American secondary students from 28 to 26%. It's a 7% decline. Whites from 15 to 12%, 20% decline. Now, this is exciting. The problem, though, what happens when white kids decline faster than black kids? What happens to your gap? It's still there. It actually can grow, okay? But these numbers are moving in the right direction. What happened between 13-14, 14-15, 15-16? Let's talk. We saw more declines. Okay? This is the number of African American students suspended. So you had 8,000 down to 7,400 down to 6,900. Okay? So it's moving in the right direction. 15% decline. This is white kids. From 2,000 to 1,800 to 1,700. Now this is closer, right? 15 to 19% decline. Still, the whites going more rapidly. These numbers, though, are all uniformly moving in the right direction. I'm going to go into the pipeline right now, but I want to just stress that suspension is just a proxy indicator for something else that's going on. If we get too obsessed about suspension numbers and getting rid of suspension, then we're missing the boat, right? When you see over-suspension happening, it's a flag. It tells you one of four things could be happening, okay? So bringing down suspension numbers, we know that may mitigate the harm. It might not be as bad, but it's not going to get to the real issue. Because the real issue is some combination of these four. One, school culture, classroom management, teacher-student relationships, and student sense of belonging, right? So that culture of that school and the skills of the teachers to manage a classroom, those need to be addressed, right? Second one, student and adult social-emotional skills, okay? Especially the social-emotional skill called self-regulation. We know plenty of teachers lack it, but it's like when you have the strong feeling, do you act on it or not, right? Right? Can you do that? But these social emotional skills are so important. In fact, research has shown consistently that they're better predictors of how much money you make as an adult than test scores. Okay? They're better predictors than test scores, yet we just have uniformly ignored them. Okay? So we're going to talk later about why a lot of young people of color come in and don't have really strong social emotional skills and how we can address it. The third one, this is for a certain number, student, family, community, dealing with what's called complex trauma. What's complex trauma? It's things like behavioral and physical health challenge, but it's often across generations. So there's trauma happening, but the parents have experienced it, the grandparents have experienced, the kids. It's in a family setting, so unlike 9/11 happens and the preschool sees it and they're terrified, and that's traumatic and you need to deal with kind of post-PTSD, right? That's different than having ongoing trauma happening in your family all the time. Those are different. And that requires the school system getting help, right? That requires bringing in folks like clinical psychologists that can deal with those really deep issues. And then finally, explicit and implicit bias in the education system. By this, explicit bias is racism, okay? Implicit bias, and everyone will get these slides and the Prezi I'm about to do. You all get them. And implicit bias is the unconscious stuff. These aren't people who are racist at all, right? It's all of those messages that we live in because of the soup of media and everything that makes teachers more likely to see black and brown kids' behavior as more aggressive and violent than a white kid doing the same thing. All of that comes together. And it's urgent to think about how we change, measure, and hold systems accountable for this. So, yeah, I want to see suspensions go down, but really what I want is to see that social emotional health is going up, trauma is being dealt with, school classroom management skills are up. Like, that's the real stuff, right? Okay, I'm going to switch now to the Prezi, and let's walk through. What we're going to do here is we're going to walk through a child's life, okay? And we're going to start, don't worry, it gets much bigger. Yeah, it's a Prezi. It doesn't say this tiny. But this is the school to prison immigration detention pipeline. We're going to go through it, we're going to talk about it, then we're going to talk about how we break it, okay? And now we just take it out, okay? It's, what it is as we're going through this, think about this. There are a number of systems traps. Systems traps they're not necessarily laid intentionally, but how they function is that once you get caught up in a system trap, instead of helping you to get out and get better, it has the impact of getting you further caught up and worse, okay? So what we're going to talk about is how we can flip those system traps around, right? So instead of making something bad worse, it addresses that bad thing and begins to offer healing. So here we have the ages 0 to 5, 5 to 11, 12, 17, 18, 24. Now, the school to prison pipeline is just basically the handoff of children from one institution to the next. Now we know that you start in your family, and then there's childcare and pre-K, elementary and secondary. Now what's happening is that increasingly those, even pre-K, but definitely elementary and secondary, are handing off to the police, okay? And the police are handing off to juvenile justice handing off to jail, jail to prison to the experience, to what it's like to be someone with a felony on your record. That's a specific experience in this country, okay? And then finally from one generation to the next. So let's start at the beginning. You got a family and a kid, okay? Now, we're gonna talk about two families, all right? Two families, two black and brown boys, okay? Little, tiny, okay? Now we have to remember that this family and child is in this neighborhood and community. And there's lots of things that are incredibly powerful and resilient about this community, but also remember those big trends, right? A bunch of policy decisions were made and investment decisions such that the environment, while full of resilience, is also full of toxic stress, right? It's full of violence. It's full of stuff that's really destructive to baby's brain development. Destructive, but not irreversible at all, okay? But think about the little baby. When you're there, between 0 and 2, 700 neurons per minute are being created, okay? Now, when you have an environment of unpredictability and violence, when people are scared all the time, what's happening with that baby's brain is that only certain parts are getting exercise. The parts that are getting exercise it's called the amygdala and the limbic system, right? It's basically the fire alarm. It's like the fire alarm of the brain. It's the thing that gets you to either fight, flee, or freeze, that is play dead, okay? And we have it because it helps us survive, right? So think about, your prey, some giant wild beast is gonna eat you, right? Right? So our system is meant to all right, the amygdala goes off, and the first thing it does is it shuts down all the unnecessary systems in your body. And that includes your prefrontal cortex, where you do all the thinking and learning. You don't need that. What you need to do is you just need to have the energy to either fight, run, or play dead if you don't see any other way out, right? So that system goes in chemicals, stress hormones, bathe your body, get you ready for it. Now usually, evolutionary-wise, this has happened, and it would be like 4 or 5 seconds, and either the animal ate you, right? Or you got away, right? And it's over. But what's happening in these communities is these little babies' brains, they never get a break. Our body, they're constantly in fight, flight, or freeze mode. The alarm they're in the red all the time. They're not, and our bodies weren't built to handle being in the red like that. And literally, not only do the higher learning parts get less exercise, but literally the cortisol in your system begins to break down your body, okay? Now, an important thing here, we have all heard the statistic that 1 in 3 black men goes to prison in their lifetime. That also means that 2 in 3 don't, okay? 2 and 3 don't. And those 2 and 3 speak to the profound resilience of communities of color living in these situations. Now, how does that happen? We have something that's as good as a vaccine against that toxic stress. As good as a vaccine, all right? What is it? What is the thing that can protect the baby's brain? It's just absolutely amazingly from all of that toxic stress and trauma. Any guesses? Yes, L-O-V-E, love. Now, social scientists call it attachment, okay? What it is that close protective relationship between the caregiver and the baby, right? And that love, literally, the definition of toxic stress is having this ongoing stressful situation unmediated by a supportive relationship. That's how you define it. So important is that relationship. So that love protects the kid. That's how the vast majority of our children survive, right? Absolutely. Now, but the problem is, while the mom is protecting the baby, nobody's protecting the mom, okay? So again, those two families. One's got the mom and she's able to do it. She's able to do that protection. So that child is 5 years old, ready to go to school, just your average 5-year-old. The other one, she breaks under the weight of this, of generation after generation of pain and suffering. She breaks, and what does that breaking look like? Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, stuck in violent relationships, mental health. All of those things, that's what happened. And when the mother breaks, there's no one there to protect the baby. So that second child just has all of this violence and fear coming in unmediated, not protected, okay? So they both go to school. So, first of all, they're both 5-year-old boys. So what are 5-year-old boys like? Just a bundle of joy. Are they good at sitting in circle? Okay, I bet they're really good at coloring in the lines. Are they good keeping their hands to themselves and not like, you know, they like you're in there and you're like, why are you guys wrestling? Do you know, like we were sitting there, we were trying. They're learning, and they're behind girls. Okay, they're developmentally these social emotional skills, this self-regulation. It just lags girls. Okay, so the girls are going to be better able to do the crayons, to do all of that stuff than the boys. Now, the whole point of school, the whole point of the first 3 years of school is for that child to learn how to be a student, right? That's where they get to learn to be a student. How do they learn? How do they learn not to like collapse into the kid next to them's lap during circle time or, you know, start bugging their neighbor? How do they learn it? They learn it through an intense, essentially, apprenticeship with a teacher. It's like the teacher goes over, and you know this because you're parents, you know that as well, and you're like, no. This is how no, this is how we do it. Okay, no, that doesn't work, let's try this. So you over and over again redirect, teach, model. And then on the 5,764th time it takes, right? It's true, and then you're like, I cannot get a, I've got a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. And I'm just like, when it does change, I'm just like, I swear I've just about given up, right? I just about given up. The child was hitting me, all sorts of things. I was like, what is wrong with you? Now, especially with a 3-year-old, right? So 3-year-olds will up and hit you, right? You'll say that, they'll take their truck and go like that. And when I first had kids and that started happening, I was like, what, are you crazy? I'm your mother. You depend on me for everything. Like, why you do it? Don't you know who I am, right? Like, what are you doing it? But the thing is, a 3-year-old has no executive function, no self-regulation. That prefrontal cortex, no, it's not happening. They're everywhere. That grows hugely between the age of 3 and 5. But that second boy, the boy who hasn't been protected, he's probably acting a lot like a 3-year-old, right? He's delayed, okay? And so what that means is that child is going to be a handful for that teacher. That child, what would you do if you had a kindergarten class and you put a 3-year-old in it? What would happen? And how would it be interpreted? So this child's going to come with a huge amount of suffering and need, but it's going to be seen as a kid that's, and is this child getting in the way of other people's learning? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's just, absolute things are slowing down, everything has to stop. Like, yeah, it's really, really hard, right? Okay? We know there's going to be conflict, and we know more and more, especially if the teacher is overwhelmed and on a pacing guide and needs to get scores up, what are they going to want to do? They're going to want to get the kid out of their classroom. So the child will be sent to the principal over and over again, and the teacher will get relief, right? We know that now more than ever, it's likely that child will also be suspended, okay? But what about the other boy? The other boy, who's just a normal 5-year-old boy. The thing with this second boy, who has the protector mom, right? Who's the mom's able to like put them in that cocoon, right? Because his skin is black or brown, his normal 5-year-old boy behavior is going to be seen as more aggressive and more violent than a white boy same type of development doing exactly the same thing. And we have powerful research out of Stanford. Okay, they did research, they brought teachers in. They read them a story, right? They read them a discipline report about some kid doing one of those minor irritating misbehaviors, like talking, not taking off their hat, wandering, right? And they get the teachers to say, okay, so this is what happens. And so first tell me how much of this interfered with your teaching, okay? How serious do you think this was, and how should it be punished, okay? And then they say, okay, so guess what? A week later, the kid does the same thing again. And then you go through the same questions. Now, the twist here is you were randomized to one of two groups. Both groups got exactly the same story, but the name of the boy was different, okay? For one group, the boy's name was Greg. For the other, the boy's name was Darnell, okay? So one group had an identifiable African-American name. That's all. Everything else was entirely the same. What did they find? After the first instance of misbehavior, it was exactly the same. It didn't matter if you were Greg or Darnell. Everyone was equally irritated. They thought it was equally serious. You got the same punishment. But after the second, upon the repeat, right, when it happened again, that's when it changed, okay? So when the boy named Greg did it again, the teacher remained just as irritated as they were last time. They thought it was serious. But what happened is this escalation effect for the boy named Darnell. Suddenly, the same exact behavior, when it's done the second time, is seen as more interfering with teaching, more serious, and deserving of a harsher punishment. So that's how implicit bias works, even for that protected child. And let me tell you, all teachers did it, both black and white. So let's get to suspension. What happens when you get suspended? Okay, what do you get less of? You get less learning, right? Okay, and when you get less learning, what happens? You fall behind and you become disconnected from your friends who go to school, right? Okay, amazing study out of Texas followed 6 million fifth graders. Can you even imagine 6 million fifth graders, right? All the way until they were 21, okay? What it allowed us to do was try to get a sense of the causal impact of a suspension, okay? So a lot of times we'll say, oh, look at, advocates will say, the kids who are suspended are dropping out more, right? But it could, because of the suspension, it could also be the kids are suspended because you're behind in class, it's better to act a fool than show everyone that you're having trouble reading. So that's really the reason why you're suspended. And being behind is really the reason why you're dropping out, right? So we have this problem. What this study did is able to take a kid, like a kid in 7th or 8th grade, and match it with a kid who's identical in terms of their family, their community, the type of school they go to, right? So they match on all these variables. They match on, I think, 70 different variables. They're able to match on disciplinary history. They're able to match on, they're able to match on test scores, on grades, right? This is what then they followed the kid for the next 6 years, and what did they find? The kid who was suspended was twice as likely than the other kid to drop out. Twice as likely to have to repeat a grade, okay? So if you get less learning, what do you get more of when you get suspended? Mm-hmm. Right? It's time to get in trouble, right? Free time, unsupervised time, right? Initially, maybe it's going to be in your house, but eventually, it'll end up on the street, okay? So what do we know? Remember, we just had that, why we talked about what the neighborhoods were like, what policing was like. When kids get a 2-day suspension, it increases the unsupervised time in poor, racially segregated neighborhoods, leads to two things. First, it leads to exposure to gang violence and community violence, right? You're out there, right, with a lot of folks who are no longer in school and involved in that. The second is you're exposed to aggressive policing, that broken windows policing, right? Do people know why Trayvon Martin was in the middle of a school day buying iced tea and Skittles? He'd been suspended, okay? It was his third suspension. The first one was for being tardy, right? The second one was for writing WTF on a locker. The third one is they did a search of his backpack, they found a Ziploc bag, and they said they found marijuana residue in it, and they gave him a 10-day, 2-week suspension. His mother was afraid for his safety in her neighborhood, so she sent him to stay with his dad in the gated community. When you are exposed to both aggressive policing and community violence, it becomes increasingly likely that eventually you get arrested, okay? And indeed, in that same study out of Texas with the 6 million fifth graders, they also found out that the kid who got suspended was 3 times as likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. And remember, they didn't do these through surveys. You couldn't do 6 million surveys, right? They did this through taking administrative data, right, from all the different systems. So what they essentially did is they found the arrest records. They found the juvenile probation records for that same kid, okay? We also know that you don't even necessarily need to go the street route to end up arrested. And that's because increasingly we have police in schools, right? Now the issue with police in schools is police are going to be police, right? Police are going to be police. In the presence of a police officer, teenagers are going to be teenagers, right? So teenagers are going to push back. That's what they do, right? That's their job. They're practicing independence. That's fine when you do it to your teacher. You can do it to the principal. But remember the video out of South Carolina, right, of that girl? Do you remember what she was doing? She refused to hand over her cell phone to the officer, right? Okay. When you do the same thing, which is defiant, yes, irritating, need to be held accountable, yes, all of that, in the presence of a police officer, it becomes resisting arrest, right? It becomes an arrestable offense just by their presence there. That redefines it, okay? So, if you get arrested enough times, eventually you end up in detention, serving time. Now, once you're in detention and you get out, you have to do this incredibly difficult thing, which is transition back to school, right? And so, in LA, for instance, kids will come out of the juvenile justice system, and principal after principal will refuse them re-enrollment. Just say, no, I don't want a troublemaker here. And so eventually, maybe they're lucky if they get into an alt program. Some will go months and months, right? And indeed, what we find is that if you're incarcerated as a juvenile, the likelihood of dropping out goes from a 1 in 10 chance to a 1 in 4 chance, okay? Now, if you have the grit, the wherewithal to keep on trying, and you get back in school, what's your attitude now? Do you think the world is fair? Okay, you could probably have quite the chip on your shoulder, huh? Right? And so when you're sitting in class again, and the teacher says to take off your hat or stop talking to your neighbor, do you escalate or de-escalate? You escalate, and what happens then? You get suspended. And this is that first feedback loop that goes round and round and round. So it's like being suspended makes you ever more likely to be suspended, right? And this works in such a way that it means that a number of young people will reach 18 having dropped out of high school. And we know right there that doubles to quadruples the probability of going to prison. Right there, right? So doubles to quadruples the probability. That's that bridge. And in fact, nationally, the probability that a black man without a high school degree goes to prison by their late 30s, 68%, nearly 70% go to prison. In California, that number is 90%, okay? So almost, I mean, like the young people we were talking to earlier today, what they said is almost all, right? Okay. And one interesting piece on that, there's sometimes a generational miscommunication that we have, because if in 1975, what was the probability that a black man without a high school education had gone to prison by the time he was 39? Okay, it's 70% now. What was it then? Any guesses? It was 15%. It was 15%, right? So the world has changed radically. The other thing that you get caught in that suspension feedback loop, right? Eventually you do end up in serving time in the juvenile system. Amazing study out of Chicago looked at what was the effect of you take a kid, and the kid has done something wrong. So you want to control for all of that, right? You want to say, look, if you end up in front of the judge in juvenile probation, you probably at that point have a lot of things going on, right? So what they want to do, they said, well, what is the effect on top of that? What is the causal effect then of getting sent to, in California we call them camps, but they're basically youth jail or prison. I don't know what you call them here. What's the effect of that? So what they did is in Chicago, they had judges, and the judges were assigned the docket randomly. And you just had judges as you as you know, some judges are jailer judges and some judges are non-jailer judges. Just judges have a different proclivity to lock people up, okay? So what they were able to do then is take two kids who were the same on everything, right? They'd had the same record, they'd been arrested the same amount of times. The only difference was one had the bad luck to get the jailer judge. And this is what they found. The kid who got the jailer judge compared to the other kid, remember, not compared to some kid in high school who's getting all A's, right? Or even all C's, right? But compared to the other kid who didn't get sent to detention, the likelihood of being found in the Illinois State Prison Database by 25, 22 percentage points more likely. That's like going from a 1 in 10 chance to a 1 in 3 chance, okay? In these systems, what happens is you bounce around in jail until finally you catch a felony, right? And we've talked all about that. But what happens actually if you get arrested and convicted of a felony and you don't have papers? You're an immigrant without documentation. What happens to you? You get deported. And what happens before you get deported?
In prison.
Exactly, right. You go to immigrant detention, right? You go to prison, you go to immigrant detention, right? Okay? What is detention? Detention is prison. It's run by the same companies that run our private prisons. The Corrections Corporation of America also run our detention centers. The same thing. But what if you got all your work, you have a green card, everything's in order, you're documented. Then what happens? You get deported. You get deported. You go to detention. In 1996, we passed a federal law that stripped basically legal immigrants of all their due process rights. It doesn't matter. And in fact, this detention deportation doesn't even have to be a felony, let alone one you've been convicted of, right? It could be that you were pulled over because your brake light wasn't working and your numbers were wrong. So by the time you make it here in the pipeline, it's like what we saw back there with those two boys. Like there was time after time when the kids were doing what kids do, act out for help, right? Here's the way, I'm just being a kid, I need this help, okay? And at every chance, instead of bringing the kid closer to adults and closer to help, what we did is we pushed and we put away and punished. What that meant is the stuff that was perfectly solvable, that was actually completely cost efficient to prevent in an early way, has metastasized. And by this time, it's become usually substance abuse and mental illness. So 53% of people in prison have a substance abuse issue and 56% have a mental health problem, about 2/3. This is using very strict diagnostic categories. And once you get into prison, that makes you sicker. Essentially, for every amazing study looking at the dose effect of being in prison, for every year you spend in prison, you lose 2 years off your life. Yeah. That really? Yeah. Oh my God. Does anyone know what that's a picture of? That's group therapy in Mule Creek State Prison in California. That's group therapy. So finally, you get group therapy. Well, you think that's going to work? The default, so it's like we got a system that's all backwards. Instead of putting the money early, where you could prevent things, we put it so late and in a setting that's so punitive that it's not going to work. Right? So you make it through alive and you get through there, worse for the wear, right? But in a certain way, your punishment's just begun because now you're a felon, right? What does that mean? Now that you're a felon, as Michelle Alexander says, the felon status makes all of the outlawed old forms of discrimination legal again. So things like all of the things, housing, anti-discrimination housing, and jobs, and benefits, right? In education, voting, right? All of those that folks' ancestors fought and died for. All of those become perfectly legal, and in some cases, the government makes you discriminate, okay? So if you take a group of folks who, for the most part, who don't have a high school education, right? Who don't have a high school degree, right? And now they're also facing legal discrimination. is it surprising that we have study after study that shows that that increases the probability of low earnings, takes 10 to 30% off your lifetime earnings, housing instability radically increases the likelihood of homelessness, and untreated health problems. And then, of course, it only stands to reason that if you're homeless, jobless, and sick, what are you more likely to do? Right? You recidivate, right? And that's the second one. You're caught in there and you travel round and round and round and round until finally it goes from one generation to the next. 2 decades after release from prison, this is a study looking at folks without a high school, dropped out of high school and had a felony. 20 years after prison, 75%, 3 out of 4 of them, remained in the bottom 20%. They remained among the poorest of the poor of the income distribution, okay? So 3 out of 4, 20 years after this has happened, are still incredibly poor, okay? It's like what having a felon status does is it's like if you think of there being a ladder of upward mobility, right? For you to get a better job, live in a better neighborhood. What it does is it kind of cuts out the rungs at the bottom, and then it makes the ground underneath it incredibly sticky. You're stuck. And if you're stuck, who else is stuck? All right? When you're stuck at the bottom, so are your children. The disadvantage passes to the next generation. And then there's probably no evidence. There's probably nothing on here that has as much evidence behind it as this circle. What do we know about the children of incarcerated parents? What do we know? We know that they're in a lot of suffering. This is suffering beyond all the other stuff that could be causing it, like the incarceration of their parents causes them suffering. Girls tend to internalize. Boys, again, externalize. And for whatever reason, boys, again, are less resilient to having their parent incarcerated. They're more likely to display externalizing behavior. What's externalizing behavior? Acting out. So what happens when that little, remember that little black or brown boy way back there now has his own child, and that child's acting out? What happens when 5-year-old boys act out in class? They get suspended, right? And we go right back to the beginning. And then finally that child, this is in generation 2, that child, are folks here familiar with adverse childhood experiences? Yes. Okay, cool. So you know that the higher your number of them, the worse your health outcomes, right? Well, let's talk about 3 of them that this child automatically has. Having a parent who's incarcerated, having a parent suffering from mental illness, and having a parent who's suffering from substance abuse. Already you start out with 3. And the more that you have, the more of these adverse childhood experiences, they're an incredibly powerful predictor of victimization, of violent victimization of perpetration, right? What it does is all of that pain feeds more violence, right? Which in the end then, remember we talk about all the community violence and the gang violence? It feeds into there, living in a family like that. And importantly, it feeds into families, right? So you get family violence in families. So how do we take this apart? The first thing we can do, okay? The first thing we can do is reform state and district policies that promote push-out. What this means is there are certain things we can just take off the table, right? So you can just say, you know what? It makes no sense to suspend a kid for being tardy. Like, it just makes no sense. It doesn't matter how many times. There's a different intervention that you do. Let's take that off. You no longer can do it, right? So in California, we had something called willful defiance. What is it? What was your version here called? Tom, are you out there? Conduct. Yeah, that's right. That's the new one. That's the 1516. Before that, it was like conduct unbecoming or something like that, right? Like, so generally, we have a lot of things in there that you could drive a truck through, okay? They're really broad and they're incredibly, incredibly subjective, right? So one of the things is to say, let's get rid of a lot of these low-level pieces. Let's take them off. And let's get rid of a lot of the subjective ones. Because yes, the subjective ones, for instance, in California, like I said, it's called being willfully defiant. Well, guess who gets to make that call, right? It's that teacher. Remember all that implicit bias stuff? Who they're going to be more likely to see as willfully defiant, right? So the thing is to begin to get the smaller things off, right? Begin to limit who can be pushed out. But that is not enough, okay? So in California, we brought suspensions down 40%. And I know things have not changed to that degree for kids in schools. Anyone can bring numbers down, especially suspensions. Because you can just say, we're not suspending anymore, right? And let me tell you, children will be worse off, right? You could avoid pushing a kid out into the street. But if you don't address all of those things, the proxy indicators, the real stuff under there, that's why I love working with Nashville, because you have this explicit commitment to do this, right? Because then that's only surface. You know, everyone loves that they can move their metrics. We need those metrics to move, and this is what else we need. We need authentic student-parent partnerships. At its most developed, that looks like parent home visits, right? That looks like, instead of saying, remember the jobs that everyone has, remember how many people are broken, instead of saying, we have our PTA meeting at 5:30 and no one shows up, I guess they don't care, right? Flip it. Flip it and get the teachers to go there. Now you're going to need this. You can't make, so many of these changes that we talked about are rooted in family dynamics. So there needs to be that connection somehow, some way. And then you need to work with the whole school. This is not a classroom by classroom thing, okay? We have tons of research on this, okay? It's a whole school change. The first thing everyone has to do in that school is you all have to agree on your values, and you have to agree on what it means to embody those values in your behavior, right? And when you all agree, and I mean everyone, janitor, woman working in the cafeteria, everyone has to be part of this, and all the kids, because they're signing up to hold each other accountable, right? That's the essence, like, no, this is how we are. The next thing you have to do then is, instead of just focusing on the bad behavior, that's the kid who's acting out gets all of the attention, right? Flip it. Begin to reward kids for good behavior, right? Begin to acknowledge and see them. Begin to flip that dynamic. And then you need to train your teachers, okay? You're going to need to train. Your teachers don't leave teacher prep programs with classroom management skills. They need those. And they need to understand this complex dynamic. They need to understand social emotional skills, trauma, implicit bias, and culturally responsive teaching. And just like you got to train your kids, you also have to help train the teachers, you also have to train the kids, right? We assume that everybody knows how to follow the rules, right? Like you say, come to class ready to learn. Like, you know, it's probably worth doing some direct instruction about what that means. But beyond that, it means when you see a kid behaving in this way, figure out what's going on underneath, okay? And then figuring out how, with the help of your principal and district superintendent, you can get help for that child. And so that means building student social emotional skill, addressing the impact of trauma and toxic stress. And if you do that, a lot of classroom disorder goes away, but not all of it. Like, one thing is to just be real about this. It's still going to happen. Conflict's still going to happen, and you need a different way of addressing conflict, right? So you need to train teachers in restorative practices. Restorative practices is a different way of dealing with when there's harm in a community. How we deal with it in the US system, somebody beats up somebody or kills somebody. We know the hurt has been done. We don't really deal with the hurt or the victim at all. They kind of go out of the picture. We become obsessed with punishing the person who did it. Like, we put everything in there. What restorative practices said is, no, let's go back and let's actually move the focus to the person who was harmed, right? And in restorative practices, what happens is that the person who was harmed and the person who did the harming have to listen to each other in this powerful way, in a ceremonial way, right? Where you have the talking stick and you tell your point of view. And then you also need to talk about how to make it better, right? You have to, what are you going to do to repair the harm? And that reparation of harm then means you're brought back into the community. And then finally, almost everything that we're talking about here is about relationships, okay? It is about, like, just like the little kid, love was the vaccine, you need to build school systems, schools and classrooms that stress and support relationships, okay? In which teachers have the time to do this. Okay? So a school culture and system that supports meaningful teacher-student relationships, community circles, student voice. Make a time, just one time. You get a middle school, just one period a week. One period a week, you give 20 minutes and you do a community circle. What's a community circle? We all circle up, we have a talking piece. We go around and there's a prompt. Prompt could be, tell us about an ancestor you admire. This is one that's pretty amazing for teachers. How about, what is something you really appreciate about your teacher? You know, what are you going to do this summer, right? All of that stuff, it's how we get to know each other. The only thing that overcomes implicit bias is relationship, Like, we know that. We can try all these debiasing efforts, but in the end, when you have a real relationship with someone, your mind isn't going to flatten them anymore. And then this is really important for this group. The district and principal leadership and commitment. I have never, ever, ever seen these things change in this real way without fierce support from leadership, okay? Fierce support. That means support from the very top, saying that we are the last best chance for these children, okay? And we're going to do everything we can to keep them in the school system and out of the criminal justice system, right? And that means then the principal in particular has a lot on their shoulders, because what they need to do is they need to make sure you have the resources there for when you talk to that kid and you realize what's going on, and there needs to be a different intervention. And some of those interventions the teacher can't do by themselves. You're going to need to bring in, it might be clinical social workers, right? You're going to need to bring in partners. You're going to need to bring in, you maybe purchase sort of curriculum for small group work, right? But it's on the principal to make sure that the menu of interventions, of alternative interventions that actually address the issue are there. And then a study showed that 20% of the Black-white achievement gap is due to suspensions alone. Just that missed learning time. But that still leaves 80% of the Black-white achievement gap, right? So we got to get serious, not only about changing the culture in schools, but we're going to do it in a way where we have improved quality and quantity of culturally and gender responsive instruction. You need rigorous, excellent instruction. You need academic press. You need high expectations, and you need all this social emotional stuff. Let's not play it like we play it. We go like one way, and then we get all soft and touchy, and then we get all one way. Like, you're going to actually, in order to really transform things for these kids, you're going to need both, okay? And then we need to think about changing policing practices, in particular the relationship of young people and the police force. And we're going to need to talk seriously about cities kicking in with youth development monies, okay? So yes, it's horrible that a kid gets suspended and then they get 2 or 3 days where they can be in the street, but everyone's out of school by 3:30. And we know what kind of jobs parents have. They're not home at 3:30. They might not get home till 8 or 9, right? So there needs to be rich youth development stuff available. And right when kids get most at risk for all this stuff, right around when they become teenagers, middle school, high school, that's when all our after-school programs go away, right? And we actually know, amazingly, that that summer employment, it's not going to help you make more money when you grow up, right? But let me tell you what it has been shown unequivocally to do. Reduce arrests, reduce violent injury, right? And increase attendance the full year after that, the full school year after that. That's the work that summer jobs can do. So, and all of that stuff, that's outside of the education system, right? That is that deep partnership you need. And then even if you do all of this, you're still going to get kids who get in trouble, right? And at that point of arrest, right, we need to create as much diversion outside of the juvenile justice system as possible. So I'm not talking about post-adjudication alternatives, right? I'm talking about how you keep them out in the first place. If this isn't a violent, serious piece, get them into a mentoring program. Get them into REAL. Get them into START. Get them into any of the programs out there. But what we know right now is that the juvenile justice system is this thing called iatrogenic. Iatrogenic means it's when you get a treatment that makes you sicker, okay? Now, even when we do that, we're going to need to think very seriously about, there's still going to be kids here that commit violent felonies and will be incarcerated. For those kids, we need to get dead serious about when they do go back to the community, intensive supports that reintegrate them back into school, okay? And then down here, we need to think about either getting police out of schools because of that dynamic, where literally just their presence, or seriously redefining their job and retraining, okay? And then a lot of times we love in pipelines to do all the work early, like with the little kids, and then we act like we don't need to pay attention to what's going on. But that 14-year-old boy has cousins, brothers, sisters, who are all 23, 25, 35, and if they are suffering and exposing that child to that Like we need to basically, you need to expand opportunities for disconnected young adults, like 16 to 25, to reconnect with work and school. So you can't just be, yes, you want to keep them in. And for the older kids, you want to give them opportunities over and over again to reconnect. On the juvenile detention side, two things we can do. We can close big state youth prisons. If you have youth prisons, they're just hurting kids, okay? The second thing is let's stop prosecuting minors as adults. Okay, that's what direct file refers to. It's when you file a case out of juvenile. Like that, if the juvenile system is iatrogenic, then switching them to a purely punitive adult system is even more so. Okay. And then we need a movement to change those tough on crime laws, to change those mandatory minimums, to reverse the spigot that keeps people going into prison, right? And we need to reform immigration enforcement so that it isn't making all of those kids in elementary school terrified that their mom or dad's going to disappear, right? Like we need that. But if we stop the inflow into prison, right, we still have 40 years of tons of millions of people with felonies, right? What are we going to do with them? We need to expand opportunities for expungement and for getting that scarlet letter F off of you. Like there needs to be more opportunities. And we need to remove the ways that we discriminate against felons, the mandated government ways, right? Like remove restrictions on receipt of public benefits, ban the box for public employment, and taking that box off that said, have you been convicted of a felony specifically for public employment? And then, listen, you could take away the whole mass incarceration system this moment, right? But that's not going to take away all of the suffering. In particular, the social emotional suffering, the drug addiction, all of that stuff is still there. What we can't do is stop a bad thing, let the money go away, right? And not get the good thing. Because our communities deserve healing, right? And so this is about money, both for reentry supports like subsidized housing and substance abuse and mental health treatment, but also for broader things like getting the money out of criminal justice into health, education, and housing, right? Getting it where it belongs. And then on the intergenerational side, this is ACA Obamacare. We have a healthcare system that if you're poor and you need healthcare, we only provide it to women and children. Until Obamacare, I know that Tennessee didn't accept the Medicaid expansion, right? Which makes it harder to say. But those states that did accept it, for the first time, non-custodial poor parents, adults, single adults who are non-custodial parents or not parents and are poor have health care. And most of these guys are men, and most of them are men of color. And insofar as that we can begin to integrate, like the system is really good at serving women and children. It's actually not even that good at serving women and children. And now it's going to have to serve all of these men. And it doesn't have the tools. A really easy, quick win is an ACEs screening, right? That becomes just as important as asking someone whether they smoke, right? That both to screen for those ACEs and then, to connect them with the behavioral health services that they need. And at the same time, the same thing goes for babies, right? For kids. When kids come in for the pediatric exam, knowing, because all of their parents' ACEs become their ACEs, right? Knowing what's going on in that child's life, knowing that little girl's dad or mom is incarcerated, knowing what's happening in the community they live in, all of those are inputs into their health, okay? And should be addressed in trauma-informed pediatric care. And then I think that we also need to have supports for healing. Okay. Like all of the injustices that I've gone over, they're not just the policies and laws. They've gotten inside of us. They're under our skin, right? They're in our relationships. I think we desperately want to heal. I know I want to forgive my father, right? We need healing, and it needs to be more than just therapy. Well, it'd be great to get therapy in the first place. But what I'm saying here is we have faith-based traditions and culturally rooted traditions of healing that need to be supported, right? In order to heal from multi-generational stuff that's going on, right? And then the last part is, so the civil rights groups, who I work with a lot, will also often say, all the suspension stuff, there's nothing wrong with the kids, it's the grown-ups and the rules. That's what's wrong, okay? And I get that. But I also want to speak this truth, which is sometimes there is something wrong with the kids' family. Sometimes when you've been looping through this for 3 generations, you're hurt. You're wounded and in need of healing. And this is my concern. If we're not paying attention to the fact that toxic stress and trauma affects Black and brown communities disproportionately, then what they'll do is they're going to go, well, we did positive behavioral interventions and supports, work for the white kids, but I don't know why it didn't work for these kids, right? So that's why you need not only reforming school discipline, but we also need to expand school-based health centers, full-service community schools, and trauma-informed care, right? So we actually need the real resources to heal those kids and those families that are dealing with trauma, okay? So you need both. And so sometimes things can feel, that I know feels huge and overwhelming, okay? So sometimes when things feel huge and overwhelming, you go to scripture, right? This is from the Old Testament, from the Talmud. Do not be daunted by the world's grief. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. You don't got to do all that on your own. We all will be taking different pieces off. But we can't turn our eyes away. We got to wade into it.